I'm going to record it to the cloud. Okay, it's recording. Hello, everyone. This is the Peter panel, and I'm saying this for the benefit of the robot that is recording us. All right. I meant to show, as I was doing the introduction, these slides that I made, but then I got flustered and I didn't. But here is Kayla's cover for Darling. This is Sisters of the Neversea. Here we have Lost in the Neverwoods and Wendy Darling. Okay, now I'm going to stop the screen sharing so that every one of our authors can have their beautiful faces in the screen. All right, so here's how this is going to go. I am going to start off with questions for our authors about their books. Then we're going to talk about their writing processes. And then I will open it up to questions from you all in the audience. I will turn to the chat then when I open it up, but I'm not going to look at questions now. So maybe hold off on popping them in there, but feel free to chat amongst yourselves. Okay. So my first question is, I want each of the authors to answer this, but let's start with Kayla and go in the order that I introduced you. I'd love for each of you to give the elevator pitch for your book so everyone gets a quick idea of what it's about. And then you can take a little more time and share with us why you wrote this story.
Wonderful. So my book, Darling, is a young adult thriller, super dark thriller. It is, as I like to describe it, Nick and Nora's infinite police procedural. It is about a young girl, Wendy, who moves to Chicago from the suburbs. And within the first week of her being there, she runs into Peter Pan while he is breaking into her house. And because he's super cute and super charismatic, he invites her to a party. And despite it not seeming like a great idea, she decides to just go with him. And it's like a modern story with like a modern diverse cast. And it hinges really tightly on like the landscape of the city in the way that there is the landscape of Neverland. And it's kind of like about her going from one end of the city, learning about all of the like Lost Boys and meeting all of these characters that we all know and love. I decided to write this book because I am very, very interested in this one feature of Peter Pan, or Peter and Wendy, the original novelization, which is that it is a book that is written in one way to be perceived by children and in another way to be perceived by adults. It is an adventure story for children and a horror story for adults. And I think there's only one other book that I know of that has that kind of like thing about it, and it is Coraline by Neil Gaiman. I was obsessed with the darker, more horrifying story of it and wanted to just lift up what was there and replicate it in the modern times.
That is fascinating. And having read it, I totally feel that intention. And I would like to say that Kayla does really exceptional sexual tension. Okay, now Cyn, tell us about Sisters of the Neversea and why you wrote it.
Certainly, thank you. Sisters of the Neversea is a classic middle grade novel. It's for ages 8 to 12, which is what we often think of. It's sort of the Charlotte's Web age, if you will. And the essential premise is that we have two stepsisters living in the contemporary Tulsa suburbs. We have Lily Roberts, who is a member of Muskogee Nation, which is my tribal affiliation, and Wendy Darling, her stepsister is British American and an immigrant. And they're navigating a time of family tension. There's some stress between their parents, some question of whether or not that marriage will work out. And then if they are stepsisters and their parents split, are they sisters after all? So Peter and Belle arrive. Hijinks ensue. Wendy is more fanciful. She aspires to be a wizard, and she is delighted to take their little brother Mikey and whisk off to Neverland for adventure. Lily is more feet on the ground. She aspires to be a zoologist, and she goes only reluctantly with Peter's shadow to rescue her siblings and bring them home. Many of the quintessential elements in Peter Pan or Peter and Wendy are still there. We definitely have merfolk, we have fairies, we have storybook pirates, we have wild beasts on the island. There is, in fact, a tiger who is a little tiger cub. And at the same time, there is some significant world building and reinvention in that. A good deal of it falls on the indigenous characters. So they are reimagined as three-dimensional human beings from specific native cultures and communities, each with a backstory and agency of their own as they navigate the wonders and dangers of Neverland.
You know, what I really loved about it is it took me back to reading, you know, as a middle grade aged reader would, and all of, you know, remember how you just wanted to be in the story of a book? I definitely wanted to be inside Sisters of the Neversea. So it was delightful that way. Aiden, tell us about your book and tell us why you wrote it.
Hello. So yeah, I'm Aiden Thomas. I wrote Lost in the Neverwoods, which is a New York Times bestseller. It's funny, I got to read an early edition of Kayla's book, and I think it's really hilarious how we were both inspired by like the same stuff, but in very different ways. So for me, Lost in the Neverwoods is a young adult contemporary reimagining is what I like to call it. And it actually takes place in Astoria, Oregon, which is a small coastal town in the Northwest. So if you know about the PNW and Astoria, that's where it takes place. And so when Wendy and her two brothers were younger, they went missing in the woods behind her house. 6 months later, Wendy was found, but her brothers never were. And the story picks up on her 18th birthday. And she is trying to like not think about her birthday because she hates her birthday. And suddenly there's kids in their small town that are starting to go missing. And so everyone's kind of looking at Wendy, wondering if she or her brothers have something to do with it. And then Peter shows up claiming to know Wendy, know her brothers, know where they are, and how to get all the lost kids back if she helps him find his shadow. So it's very atmospheric, super dark. It's very dark. I was super interested in all of these really kind of morbid, dark parts of the original canon that I really wanted to explore. And while Kayla was like, Peter Pan is the issue, I was like, yeah, but he's like so like traumatized, and like I'm interested in that, so let's unpack that. So yeah, it has to do with mental health, family, complicated family structures and stuff like that. And yeah, it's really creepy, and I love it. It was so much fun to write.
I could tell you were having fun, and it was gloriously tense. Okay, Allison, tell us about Wendy Darling.
First of all, I got to say everybody else's book sounds amazing, and my TBR pile is just about to, grow again because I want to read everybody else's take on the Peter Pan story now. So mine is technically a novel for adults, but one of the point of view characters is actually Wendy Darling's daughter, Jane, who is about 11 years old. So, could be some young adult elements in there as well. But it is sort of a dark feminist take on what happens to Wendy after her time in Neverland. Basically, Peter Pan shows back up in her life when she's a mother with a daughter of her own, and kidnaps her daughter to take her to Neverland to be the new Wendy. And she sets out to rescue her daughter. And sort of the elevator pitch I gave myself to write it is, what if taken, but also Peter Pan? So Wendy Darling has a very particular set of skills that's going to help her rescue Jane and finally kick Peter's ass after all these years.
And it had me from the first page. It's just absolutely beautifully written. It's got lots of elements that I love. A fractured timeline. It's got multiple viewpoint characters, and so it's a spectacular read. All right. So I'm going to start with questions that I'd like Aiden and Kayla to answer. You've both written books that felt like thrillers to me, but your views of Peter Pan are quite different from each other. Can you tell us about the Peters you've created and how you came to see them in this light.
Do you want to go first, Kayla?
Okay. Books are like cousins.
Yeah.
So funny. Okay. All right. So for me, the experience of I don't know, I think in 7th grade when Peter Pan 2003 came out, and like there was just a bunch of Peter Pan media coming out in the early 2000s. And there was always this thing about the character where he was like a hot guy, like a hot, mysterious, like Edward Cullen type guy who's just like weird, but in like a sexy way. And, you know, I wasn't really vibing with it that much. Like I wasn't really like into it, like not to like go off the rails and be like Twilight or whatever, but like I was always Team Charlie over Team Edward or Team Jacob, because it was like, okay, somebody needs to be an adult in this scenario. I was always just like, I don't know, I just feel like this situation is really out of hand. And when I started reading, like rereading Peter Pan, focusing on what he was in regards to the like safety and vitality of the people around him, and also the reactions that other characters in the book have to Peter himself, was always something that really fascinated me, because I feel like the idea of Peter as this kind of like romantic anti-hero, you know, cool guy who takes you somewhere that you probably shouldn't be, and you know your parents don't want you to be, so you can have fun and come home safe and sound and remember that night for the rest of your life, all the way until you're an adult. Like that as something that many characters throughout the original story were really wary of him. There was this kind of like a vibe where they would be having fun, and all of a sudden they'd be like, we're not safe. And like that emotion is so integral to like my high school experience and my like youth experience of having the freedom to get into dangerous situations and then realize that maybe the adults should be there like all along, you know, and you start like craving that, you know, that perspective. And I really wanted to create a world that represented Peter and the like anxieties that the other children had around him, and that the adults actually inside of the book had around him as well, and combine it with that like really rich self-sufficiency that teenagers have nowadays with the technology that we have that they protect themselves with. So I know Darling isn't out yet, so none of you guys have read it, but there's this feature in it where the main character has her cell phone, and like she has it and she can use it and stuff, but the longer she's out with Peter, the less battery it has, and it dies like 75% of the way through the book when things are like maximum terrible and she needs the most help. And she's brand new to the city. And of course, you know, you've got Google Maps and like Uber and stuff like that, but without your phone, you're just like a kid outside in the dark. And you can't reach your family. You don't know what the police situation is. And just that like primal terror of, I was prepared, I knew what I was going to do, but now I have to like be extracurricularly self-sufficient to protect myself from somebody who does not have my best interest at heart and is too involved with his own thing to create a scenario where there is like protection and safety for the children around him, was something that I was like super into. But before I pass this over to Aiden, and then immediately read Aiden's book, and I was like, oh no, I like Peter, I feel bad. Or I used to want to like fight him. Like, you taught me to love again.
I think that's kind of the fun thing about Peter, though, is that you can kind of read him two different ways. And for me, I was very invested in the original canon, and Peter Pan 2003 especially like had some lines directly from the book where I was like, oh, there's a lot going on here. Like in particular, for me, when I read about Peter, I see a child who is deeply traumatized and not handling it well. There's like some really choice lines. I mean, they're all kind of messed up in that book, but like there's one where Peter, when he like goes back to Wendy and she's asking him about like Captain Hook and the pirates and stuff like that, and he says this line that's, oh, I forget about them after I've killed them. And then I was like, okay, well, that's PTSD. Like, that is dissociative amnesia that's happening. And then kind of like, I really like kind of grabbed that and dug into it. And there's one point, Toodles, I think it's Toodles who accidentally shoots down Wendy. And like a line that he says is like, oh, all my life I've wanted a mother. And then when she finally showed up, I shot her dead. And I was just like, oh my God, yeah, let's talk about that. And then so for me, I was like, okay, if Peter has all of this emotional baggage, And then if Wendy goes through this experience of being in Neverland, I think an interesting thing about Lost in the Neverwoods is that it doesn't take place in Neverland, it takes place in our world. And kind of the after effects of Wendy going on this experience to Neverland with her brothers, and then her brothers not coming back with her. And then, like, what does it mean to suddenly come back in the real world? She can't remember what happened. She doesn't remember Neverland. She doesn't remember being there. It's just kind of this huge blank space in her memory. And that was specifically inspired by those lines from Peter and his dissociative amnesia. And so, yeah, I really wanted to unpack that kind of the really like dark inner turmoil stuff. And, you know, like I said, PTSD, there's definitely intense depression, and the antagonist of the whole story is the shadow. That's not a spoiler, which is just kind of the embodiment of depression and kind of self-suffering and isolation, and how it feeds off of those feelings. So yeah, for me, it's so funny how just like two sides of the same coin is like Kayla saw that and was like, oh, that is someone that cannot be trusted, and like they need to be locked up. Like, and then I was like, okay, but he has so many issues and problems, and like I want to explore that. And I think I totally agree where like in those like more recent things they were like trying to turn Peter into like this heartthrob, but in mine he's very childlike, and he's kind of chaotic, and definitely has some sort of attention deficit disorder, and is like has all this really heavy stuff going around. And what does it mean when you have all of this dark things going around, but you still need to be this bright, positive entity? So yeah, that's what I was really interested in.
Honestly, I was like listening to you talk. This is the second panel that we've done about our respective books, so I've had time to like think. And I think that the main like difference between the like core of both of our books is this one sentence that I've been thinking about for a couple days, and it is, if Peter is a child, he deserves our tenderness and consideration. But if he is not a child, what is the weight of his transgression?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I love it.
I think that's great. And you know, Aiden's book is a trauma past, and Kayla's is this is trauma unfolding.
Yeah.
And so if that's your jam, do not miss these books. Okay. Cynthia and Allison, let's talk Wendy's. Your Wendy's are different from one another. One is a child, one is a grown woman. Can you tell us about your visions of the Wendy character and how you came to have them? Let's start with Allison, then Cynthia.
Sure. So one of the things I actually really wanted to do with this book was have a mother who goes on adventures. So I wanted to start with Wendy. You know, part of the whole reason she's taken to Neverland in the first place as a child is to be a quote unquote mother to Peter and the Lost Boys. And Peter kind of has a very specific idea of, you know, what a mother is supposed to be. She's supposed to cook for them and tell stories and keep them safe and basically kind of take care of all their mess for them so that, you know, they never have to stop playing. They never have to take responsibility for anything. And I wanted sort of Wendy to have her chance to kind of actually define motherhood for herself and, you know, to be an actual mother. And then, you know, sort of what does that mean to her? What does it mean for the story? And just the fact that, you know, in so many kind of, you know, fairy tale or fairy tale inspired stories, we see mothers are kind of absent. They're sort of, you know, either left behind at home waiting, maybe they're dead, maybe they're even sort of the antagonist to the story. So I really wanted to sort of center, you know, a mother as a protagonist going on an adventure, not sidelined in a way that, you know, they have to step aside and make room for the next generation to have their adventures, but she's still, you know, sort of very active, very much the hero of her own story, and kind of reclaiming her life along the way as she's trying to rescue her daughter. So that was really sort of my vision for Wendy, is like, you know, what does it mean to actually be a mother, but also to be a hero? And what are the different ways of being a hero? You know, not always necessarily punching your problems in the face, but what sort of unique things does she bring, you know, from this perspective and from everything that she's gone to that make her uniquely equipped to deal with the situation at hand.
And done so brilliantly. Sin, what about you? Tell us about your roughly Wendy.
Roughly Wendy. My original concept for her was that she, you know, she's so iconic to Barry's story, that she would in some ways be, along with her little brother, a representative of the idea of wonder and the tension between being wrapped by wonder, immersed in wonder, bedazzled by wonder, versus growing up. And do you have to surrender that part of yourself? Is there a way that you can really navigate the sort of slip from tween to teen, child to emerging adulthood, hang on to what's magical, and also be able to proceed with your feet on the ground in a way that is in consideration of the realities of your situation and that of your family and community more broadly. So she can get very swept up, but she also has to remember where her heart and her home is. And I think that's kind of the essence of keeping the child alive inside of you as you come into a place of greater maturity.
I momentarily lost you all for a moment. Okay, very cool. Now, this is a question for Kayla and Allison. So let's go back to trauma. Both of your books deal with it. And I think that the broader American culture is bad at dealing with trauma. And Allison, when I was reading your book, thinking about soldiers coming home from World War I, they were called shell-shocked, and the US government spent billions of dollars right in the midst of the Depression trying to figure out how we would get soldiers who wouldn't be shell-shocked by violence, wouldn't be traumatized by combat. This is actually part of the reason that the US military for a long time made it impossible for GLBTQ soldiers to serve. People with these identity elements were scapegoated as being trauma susceptible. So can you share your thoughts on trauma and marginalization and the role you think art has in confronting and healing? Who wants to go first on that one?
Kayla, do you want to start?
Okay. So a majority of the characters in Darling have marginalized identity. We have a Tinkerbell and Tiger Lily, who I've replaced with an actual indigenous character name is Ominatago, and she's Ojibwe. And all of the Lost Boys, they are foster children and homeless children. And the way that they navigate dealing with Peter Pan, who is kind of like their guardian / like weird big brother kind of vibes for him, but he is, the person in their house who is in charge of stuff that's happening. The way that they're dealing with him is the way that a lot of teenagers who are in difficult situations tend to deal with circumstances that are dangerous or out of their control. And it's with an amount of maturity that is usually kind of like beyond those circumstances because they have to. So one of the things that I feel really passionate about is paying homage to teenagers who do things to fix situations that they're in and succeed. I think that a lot of books written for teenagers are, and I've written one, where it's like, you talk about, oh, there's something bad happening. You have to turn to the adults around you. You have to consult the adults around you in order to be safe. Sometimes that is not available, or the circumstances just aren't set up in a way that's going to work well for that. So teenagers banding together and being like, this is a problem that we need to fix, and we need to think smart and to act appropriately and figure out a way to make this no longer an issue. Teenagers do that in real life, and I wanted to put a very crisp example of that in this situation. And one of the things that is one of my favorite things about Peter Pan is the domestic nuclear family thing that they were doing. So the book came out in 1904, so that was like the peak of industrialization. So the nuclear family model was becoming more popular, just in regards to just capitalist formalizations. So, there being a thing where Peter is really focused on having a mom, having a child, he is the oldest, but not, neglected, and just talking about why it is important for him to have that nuclear family, and then showcasing how that kind of breaks down within the world he created, because it's not actually a family created out of love. It's a family created out of like fear and trauma and magic and all of that fun stuff. So I actually did something really cool in Darling where I created like the kind of like false nuclear family structure that Peter created for himself to experience, and a real one that is a found family, because I love doing found families in my books, where there are the children who've decided that they are going to be the people who are going to create safety that Peter does not create, and the children who are taking care of each other. There, I think there's one of the kids is like the cook in their family, and one of the kids is like the baby, and one of the kids maintains their house and everything, and how they really have built this family underneath the umbrella of a much more traumatizing family structure. So that was something that I really wanted to kind of dig into.
I absolutely love found family stuff too. And it's, I love hearing you say that, because that's actually something I tried to do with my version as well. Sort of Wendy, you know, as an adult kind of builds her own family in response to a lot of those traumas, and kind of, it's almost like the flip side of the way Peter tries to force kind of a found family, like, I found you, I get to keep you now, and you're going to be my family, and you're going to, you know, be in this role that I assigned to you. Whereas Wendy, kind of in response to her trauma, begins to find people, you know, that she can care for, that who care for her, and, you know, they actually listen to each other and understand each other. And there are sort of various marginalizations, a lot of which, you know, people don't really, or Wendy specifically doesn't really have, you know, the language for. Basically, she's asexual, but she doesn't really have the language for that at the time, you know, that it's set. Not, people weren't really talking about that. But, you know, she still has people that she loves and she cares about, and she's not really quite sure how to express that, but she does find people, you know, who, her husband is gay but closeted, and they sort of have an arrangement with each other of like, you know, I'll protect you, you protect me, and we're going to build this family together, because we care about each other and we're friends and we love each other, just not in sort of that traditional family model. So we're going to build something that works for us. And so, you know, sort of Wendy's dealing with her own traumas of, you know, having been institutionalized after nobody believed her about Neverland, and the people who were supposed to, you know, help make her better basically just kept telling her that, you know, her version of reality wasn't correct, that, you know, she should just accept the version of reality that they were giving to her. So it was a lot about like, you know, suppress, push away, lie to yourself, and everything will be fine. Accept this version of reality and everything will be fine. So she sort of has that trauma. Her brother, Michael, is a soldier. He has trauma from war. So there is a lot of, you know, different kinds of trauma going on, and people sort of coping with it in their own way, or trying to cope with it in their own way, as they try to sort of rebuild an idea of family and come to a new understanding of family that's a little bit healthier for all of them, hopefully.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating. And I loved the relationship that Wendy has with her husband, and that just, you know, instant safe place they create. Okay, Aiden and Sin, both of your books contain very young characters who are vulnerable. The original Peter Pan, you know, is a lot about not wanting to grow up. And I find the dissonance here between that vulnerability and resistance fascinating. Growing up is viewed as the scary thing. Staying a child forever is Peter Pan's ideal, but the most vulnerable people in your books are little children. So tell me about your view of childhood, and how do your stories empower children and keep them safe in a dangerous world? Sin, you want to go first?
Sure. When I think about the people that I prioritize in the society in kind of a more global way, I think first of elders and children. And so in this world of Neverland that is ruled by an eternally young boy to a certain extent, it was important to me to integrate a sense of elders in the larger culture of the island, in the indigenous beings of the island, if you will. So there is a fairy queen, there is a merfolk queen. We have this sense of indigenous wisdom that's been passed down by native children who've been taken to the island in the past. And it's because of that wisdom that the kids are able to take care of themselves and each other. So that intergenerational tie is in some ways, I guess because it was a big part of my own childhood, my way of throwing out a lifeline, and also really pushing back against ageism and honoring those that have come before us, those who are passing down what we need to know to survive, them looking forward to us, and us looking forward to the children as though they are valued, as though they are the priority, and that sense of reciprocity that comes with that dynamic. You know, the elders are the decisions they make are for the good of the current young children and the generations to come. And likewise, the young children gain knowledge and in turn receive it with respect and gratitude.
Yeah, for me in Lost in the Neverwoods, to kind of set the stage, the dedication for Lost in the Neverwoods is to every heavy heart that had to grow up too fast. So for me, I was really interested in, you know, what is it like for so many teenagers or even younger than that who have been failed either by society or by their parents. For Wendy, kind of after this traumatic event, her parents can no longer be her like attachment caregivers. Like they're too stuck in their own trauma of the situation to provide that for her. So it's, for Lost in the Neverwoods, it was more about like taking care. Wendy is a caretaker. She volunteers at a hospital. She likes to read to kids who are at the hospital. And she's so focused on taking care of other people, but that's like kind of what all of her energy is going towards. It's kind of even what she uses to distract herself from her own traumas and depression and stuff like that. And so, yeah, she's like the caretaker. Like, even though she's not with Peter anymore, she's still a caretaker because she's taking care of her parents. She does all the cleaning, she does the grocery things, and her parents are just kind of existing through the world. And that's such a common experience for a lot of teens and even kids who are younger than that. So for me, when I was writing this book, I really wanted to like give respect and honor to those kinds of kids and their experiences. And what does it mean to like have to work through those, and even like how do you work through those? So kind of Peter and Wendy interacting with each other. Peter is helping Wendy figure out how to kind of rediscover her childlike sense of wonder, or even just to be able to relax and enjoy herself, because from what she's gone through, being happy makes her feel guilty. So Peter is trying to break her out of that and to let her like experience joy and carefreeness and this childhood experience that she didn't get to have when she was growing up. And then on the flip side, you have Peter, who is very like, oh, I just want happy things to happen. I want to ignore the bad things because they're so bad, like they do all these things to me. So he's avoidant. And so she's trying to help him grow up and like really look at himself and look at what he's gone through and what does that mean for him. Yeah, so yeah, for like when it comes to that kind of family dynamic and what does it mean to grow up and protecting childhood, it's kind of like, no, childhood isn't carefree all the time, and like it's more about processing trauma and like how do we get through the other side, and how do we kind of reclaim childhood even when, you know, we're 18 or whatever.
Yeah, isn't it fascinating? Like even the best of childhood is probably traumatic for people, and you know, in certain times. Okay, so now questions for the group. I want to know how long you've been working on your books, and you know, we know that art responds to the time we're living in. What are you responding to with your book? So talk amongst yourselves. I mean, how did all these things, do you think, bubble up together?
Well, one of the things that Aiden and I share is that both of us came up with her concepts a long time ago. I plotted out Darling in 2013, and I actually waited until I had The Wicker King and The Way of the Stars out because I wanted to build my skill to a point where I felt like I was good enough of a writer to tell that story. So I wanted to wait myself out. But, you know, having that much time to kind of like sit and think and plan how I was going to do certain things and how I was going to structure the thrillery elements and how stressed out I wanted my readers to be really gave me an opportunity to do like a lot of really hard research. And even though Darling is an adaptation, it's like a direct chapter by chapter adaptation of the original book. So you can, if you are a teacher or a librarian, you can actually read the two books right next to each other and see
So
how it
cool.
progresses.
So
Yeah, tell us, Kayla, how many master's and PhD theses you read?
So many. I read like 42-ish, 42, 43. I just kept pumping it out. I wanted to know what the people who were authorities on analysis of the original text thought about certain things. Because like in academia, usually when people are analyzing the same thing, stuff kind of breaks into like two camps, one camp that thinks one thing, one camp that thinks another thing, and then they fight each other for decades. So I wanted to know what the fight was so that I can like appropriately, talk about certain topics and like introduce certain things from a perspective of somebody who has knowledge not only about it as like a piece of fiction and a integral like American part of our common culture via the Disney film, what people who have only experience with the Disney film would think about that property while picking my book, but also from the perspective of what the academics are thinking, because there are people who literally just only read these kind of books to add them to their body of knowledge. And I would like to respect the people who spend their lives taking care of these important intellectual properties.
yeah, I think what's funny is that I was one of those academics. When I went to undergrad, I double majored in psychology and English, and I wrote several term papers on the psychoanalytic critique of Peter Pan and particularly the characters throughout the story. So I was so deeply invested in being like, let's talk about the trauma, like let's unpack it all. That once I started getting further into like my writing, I was like, oh, this is a story that I want to write about. So yeah, when I was in undergrad, I was already writing about the like topics and themes that would later become Lost in the Neverwoods, but I didn't write Lost in the Neverwoods until I was actually in grad school, and it was my my thesis. The whole first draft, I wrote it for my thesis, and yeah, so it's just so funny how that works. Like when I was very young, I was obsessed with Peter Pan. I have 2 Peter Pan tattoos. And I was just very interested in kind of like the magic and the brightness of it. But when I got older and then I finally read like the original canon, I was like, oh, this is super dark, and like Disney, nobody told me about this, and I like dark stuff. So it kind of was like sparked this whole new interest for me. And yeah, so it's been a very long time coming.
I guess I'll jump in. It's so interesting hearing you all speak about Peter Pan and what it's meant to you over time. For me, growing up as a kid, I had a certain amount of anxiety around Peter Pan. As a young child, the idea, especially that friends of mine would see or read certain versions of the story and come away thinking that it was in some ways a representation that spoke to Native or Indigenous people was terrifying. As a little girl, I remember a version of it showed at the drive-in theater in my town, and I didn't want to go to school for a couple of days because I didn't want kids to make that association. And in many ways, that's emblematic. I was always a huge reader as a child. I mean, the most enthusiastic. I even won a reading contest, Mid-Continent Public Library. Most books read over the summer. I was that kid. At the same time, I really steered away from anything that had any hint of Indigenous content through the cover art, through the title, whatever it might be. And so, reconciling that, how does someone who was that child, who was really almost too scared to go to school, with someone who would grow up to enter the world of children's books and do a retelling that has a definite Indigenous attitude, is very much centered on the girl characters and much more welcoming in terms of gender dynamics in the whole. I think that it happened now because of the healing and progress that I'm seeing in children's books, that I gave Peter a chance to both face up to what he had been doing wrong all along, and also gave him a chance for redemption. That this is a moment of hope and reinvention, that, you know, for Indigenous voices, we are seeing an unprecedented rise and celebration, and that's true of many marginalized, underrepresented groups, that the very book that was in some ways a beacon of the message, you do not belong here, is an opportunity to reframe that and say, this is a new era, and every child is welcome in the storytelling circle. Indigenous children like me don't need to be afraid to see themselves misrepresented in the world of books. They belong in the world of books. They belong in the world of story. They are heroes that everyone can share.
You did that so well. I mean, I loved how you reframed and reclaimed the dignity of Indigenous people. Allison, what about you?
I feel like my story really pales in comparison to everybody else's inspiration for writing their books. This was actually not really ever intended to be a novel. It started life as a flash fiction story that I wrote in 2017, which is obviously, you know, the most logical place to start a novel. And after I wrote and published that flash fiction story, I kind of thought it was a one and done thing. And then it just sort of kind of kept speaking to me. And I thought, well, maybe I could expand it into a longer story, or maybe I could expand it into a novella. And it just kind of kept talking to me, and I kept wanting to know more about, you know, Wendy's story and the characters around her. And it just kind of kept expanding from there. So it was almost like an accidental novel. And in a way, I actually kind of had to trick myself into writing it, just like telling myself I wasn't actually writing a novel. I'm like, oh, well, I'm just expanding this a little bit more. I'm not really writing a novel. And that kind of made it less intimidating for writing a first novel. So I'm not sure in what ways it might, you know, speak to our time or not, but I guess it was just kind of the right time in my life to you know, trick myself into doing it that way, and just trying to, you know, expand something very, very short by the fact that, you know, the idea just wouldn't leave me alone. I've always found the Peter Pan story to be kind of fascinating, and it's sort of one that I've, you know, been thinking about for a while, and I've always found the darkness in it fascinating, and you know, wanted to delve deeper into that, and, you know, explore a lot of the things kind of around the margins that are there under the surface of the original, and really just kind of, you know, bring them directly to the surface.
I think so much thought and heart went into it. And in terms of, like, if I was saying why this book was written now, I think it deals with the gaslighting that people who identify as women have experienced. How, you know, we're told, no, this didn't happen, and no, this is not your life, and unless you agree to our version of the narrative, you will be sent out. So anyway, I found it to be extremely timely from that point of view. Okay. Here's a little bit of a speed round. If you could be any character in the original Peter Pan, who would you be and why? Let's do Allison, Cyn, then Aiden and Kayla.
Ooh, that's a tough question. I feel like 4 answers or 5 answers immediately sprang to mind. First I was like, ooh, Tinkerbell. Ooh, no, Captain Hook. Ooh, I want to be the crocodile. So really, I mean, I am horrible at picking or choosing anything. I actually think all of characters would have fun aspects. So I'm going to cheat by not really answering the question and, you know, saying that they would all have certain fun aspects to them.
Cyn, who would you be?
I would have been an unnamed mermaid. I really dived, if you will, into that part of the mythology because it was probably the least developed and the most fascinating. And I loved the idea, the opportunity to create a little society and how it was interacting with the fairies. In my version, the fairies are the guardians of the land, the skies, and the animals, and the merfolk are the guardians of the seas and the sea creatures. And so there is this sense of purpose and belonging. You know, this is where they're from. These are their waters. How do they feel about all this? That's what I want to know.
Aiden?
I really love the mermaids too. I'm fascinated by them. I have one of my 2 tattoos is a very large piece on my thigh of the mermaid that tried to drown Wendy because she's my favorite. But if I'm thinking outside of that, I'm like, everyone's kind of a bummer, honestly, because like they all have their own like issues to work through. I think my friends would label me as a Wendy though, as like I'm a Cancer to preface. I'm a very sensitive soul and I like taking care of people, so probably a Wendy, but I think my personality is kind of a Peter. I'm all over the place and I'm kind of, you know, obnoxious and bouncing off the walls. So. Mermaid would be fun though.
Kayla?
Okay, so 2, I think first, the crocodile. I'm a fan of lurking. I'm a fan of being in the background, not totally involved in what's going on, menacingly making noises that freak everybody out. I like that. But I'm also a fan of Smee. I like the idea of being like an understudy to a much more histrionic queer coded character and just kind of like in the background having like a weird homo platonic relationship with him. Like, that's my vibe. That's how I live my life daily. So like the crocodile looks to me.
Okay, one more speed round question. If you had a chance to never grow up, would you take it? Kayla, let's start with you.
Honestly, I think aging is one of the greatest gifts. It's from as a woman, there is not a lot of representation of older women in a lot of dynamic media, especially cool stuff like action movies and horror movies and, you know, strong older women dealing with really tough stuff like they do every day in real life. But I have been very gifted to be surrounded by a lot of powerful, strong older women. So I am looking forward to and excited about aging and getting older and learning more about myself and learning, you know, my limits and my true desires as an individual. So I would love to grow old.
Allison, what about you? Growing old, staying a kid?
Sorry, my mute button got stuck temporarily. Growing old, definitely. I mean, I'm a big fan of seeing what happens next. And I feel like the idea of sort of being stuck in one age would lead to sort of a bit of stagnation. And, you know, there's sort of, you're different people at different points in your life. And I don't think I would want to miss out on anything that I've done so far. So I can't wait to see kind of what happens in the next part of my life. I want to keep going.
Aiden?
Definitely growing older. I'm Latinx, and so in our culture, there's a lot of honor to being older. And so I think a lot of people are afraid of growing up, who maybe culturally like don't have that, like kind of waiting for them. And so for me, I'm very excited. Like I'm excited to have the younger generations and like be like a storyteller to them and like have them take care of me. That sounds great. My sister is definitely going to be the matriarch, so like she has that power and that's fine. But like I'm looking forward to getting older. I'm gonna be a weird old person, and I think that's gonna be really fun.
Right on. Sin, what about you?
You know, I think that there is a certain not childish, but childlike quality to many of the elders that I loved. A certain sparkle, a certain mischievousness, freedom to be perhaps more themselves than they've had at any other point in their life. I have a grandmother who's in her 90s and is utterly delighted not to have to self-censor a thing that she says and feels perfectly free to sing as she walks down the halls. And you know, her general attitude is, what are they going to do to me now? And that there is something in that that's beautiful and empowered, and there's something in that that is clearly pulling from her inner 7-year-old all at the same time.
That's actually really cool. I mean, you can retain aspects of the child you were as you get older. And I, you know, I think that's a fun thing. And one of the things when I'm writing books and when I'm reading books is I'm always thinking about, you know, what would little Martha have thought? And, you know, trying to carry, you know, the best parts of childhood forward. So let's talk more generally about writing now. What does your writing look like and how has it changed over time? Kayla, let's start with you.
Certainly. So I actually did a complete structural shift for the book Darling. My traditional writing format is actually an accessibility format because I have really bad ADHD and it's very difficult for me to like kind of sit and write block text. So my first two books, The Wicker King and The Way of the Stars, were written in vignettes. Very like Francesca Leo Block-ish, if anybody remembers her. She's my idol. But for Darling and my next book that is going to be coming out next year, which is a train heist novel. Macmillan purchased it and they were like, you have to write it. You have to like write it in the regular format. And I was like, okay. It was so hard. So like, this is my first big girl book, basically. So be very gentle and kind to me about it because I tried really hard. But so for me, for writing, because I have this disability, I need to be very, very organized about my work. I can't just kind of sit there and just go off creatively and write myself into a corner and write myself out. I have no discipline, okay? Like I need to manufacture the discipline. So I write really tight outlines, like maybe 5 or 6 page outlines, chapter by chapter. And then I sit down and I just write what I wrote, which is, it's very architect, not as much gardener. But it's pretty good for when I do like pitches for books and stuff, because then I'll give somebody a pitch and I'll be like, that is exactly what you're ordering. Like fast food, here it is. It's finished, you know, which is something that's really specific to my, I guess, craft as a writer.
Fascinating. Aiden, what about you?
I'm also have ADHD and I can't keep focused for anything. So I do really intense outlines. I think it's funny that Kayla's like, oh yeah, you know, 6 pages. My last book, the one I'm working on right now, the outline is currently at 52 pages. So I do it super intensely because if I leave myself, if I start wandering, like I'll get lost and it'll take me years to write a book and I don't have the time for that. But so it's really funny. I have these 2 things. This is what I outlined Lost in the Neverwoods in like the first time, and it's literally like every chapter. And then I had like inspiration pictures and I like sketched out the floor plan of Wendy's house even. And then this is the bound thesis. Am I holding that? That's upside down. This is the bound thesis when I like finished grad school, and then I have the finished book. So yeah, I very intensely outline things. Instead of doing them in notebooks, I use Google Docs now because I like having access to it wherever I am. But yeah, I very intensely plan everything out. Otherwise, like I would never be able to get anything done, honestly.
Cyn, then Allison.
I'm very much a sense of place writer, and so this past year with its challenges has been particularly difficult to me. The book that I was originally going to be working on and I did put together maybe 120 pages involved me going to places that were not open and traveling in ways that were not always considered a good idea at certain windows. So I actually decided that I would go back more thoroughly into a land of imagination. That if there had to be a place to ground me in story, then the place could at least exist in my own mind without having to, I had to fact check my own internal consistency, but not the consistency with the real world. Essentially though, what I generally do is that I'll write a full draft of a story with a beginning, middle, and end, say 50 to 80,000 words. And I print it, I read it, I delete it, delete the file, and I throw it away. And then I trust that armed with the knowledge of what I found out through the process of having written that draft, I'll have a clearer vision to provide a better foundation for the quote unquote real first draft, that anything that was of value will reoccur in my brain. and I write, I know that is very upsetting to people when I say this. I do not require it of my MFA students. If any of you are out there, please do not panic. But people will always say, that's such a brave thing. And no, it's not. It's clearly the product of fear and anxiety. If I'm writing a draft that no one is ever going to see, that I'm just using to find out what's going on with the main character wants, what research questions I have to answer, that takes tons of pressure off. And then armed with all of the answers from having had that process, I feel much more comfortable opening a new file and starting over. I have much more up here to draw on.
The first time I ever heard that, I mean, I crumbled into 1 billion tiny pieces inside because I hang on to my work, like I'm a crocodile. Anyway, Allison, what about you? Do you delete everything or are you normal?
First of all, I just love hearing other people's process for doing stuff. And I have great admiration for the people who, do the very detailed outlines and have a logical plan in mind, because I do not. I started out, I guess, as a short story writer, and I never outlined anything because, short story is a very sort of manageable length of thing to kind of hold all in your head at one time. And I carried that over to doing my first novel. So maybe eventually it'll evolve into a more organized process. But thus far, I would say I'm a very sort of chaotic novelist, and I just tried to figure it out as I went along. I left myself little notes, but I didn't really outline intensely. And hopefully it worked out. Somebody chose to publish it. So that's something at very least. But yeah, my process is very much sort of figure it out as I go along. And if I end up, writing myself into a corner, that's what the editing phase is for. So it's like a cross. I don't quite delete everything. I'd like move chunks elsewhere and rewrite, but I don't let them go just in case. But I do like that idea of, writing to discover, getting rid of it, and then trusting yourself that, the stuff that's meant to be there will resurface again. That's a really cool idea. Maybe I'll have to give that a try sometime.
I know we have a lot of writers here. You've been glancing at the chat and can see this. And so what's something that has been a hard part of your process, but that you've got a system for? I mean, Kayla, you kind of already talked about this with, with your outlining, but is there some other great tip? And can we, give your best tip to the writers in the room?
Sure. So aside from just doing like a regular outline, I actually do 3 outlines, and they're for different things. I do one plot outline, obviously. And then the second outline that I do is the journey, like the emotional journey of the characters and how they're developing and changing. I want to make sure that it's consistent with the plot so that it feels like a natural progression of learning things, having like emotional impact. And then I do a third outline. It is what I want my readers to feel while they are reading my book. And that's where I kind of control the intensity of the like stress in the thriller. I have a very cinematic style. I'm mostly inspired by like films over other books. So my books genuinely feel like you can shotgun them in one sitting of maybe a 4-hour read and just get more stressed out and more stressed out and more stressed out until like maybe the last 20 pages, and then you're like, thank God, happy ending. Oh my God, I'm so tired. Like that is the thing that I design for all of my books on purpose. And then when I'm sitting down and doing my like first draft, and I only write one draft of every book because my ADHD doesn't allow me to do multiple drafts. Like I genuinely a disabled person. Because I've done the outlines to have that kind of, structure for it. Usually when I send my stuff to my publisher, it's mostly just kind of like line editing and copy editing, because the structure of the story is so tight to the way that a reader should feel while they're reading it that I don't ever really need any like major shifts or outline changes to the plot.
Anybody else have a great writing discovery, that really helped solve a difficult problem that you'd been having?
Mostly because of representations that I tend to write and my affection for writing people who are very invested in community. I often have big casts. and it can be a lot to keep track of. We have a tendency to fall into our protagonists and not necessarily look as far beyond them as we might. And so it's not really a process so much going in, but rather a layer of revision wherein I'll go through the draft and do a full revision with each secondary character in mind, including an antagonist if there is one. And it's not necessarily the idea that everything I figure out about that person's story as the hero of their own journey will show up on the page, but I need to make sure that it's hanging together in my head, and paying a special attention to when two characters reunite in a book after a break, what each of them left with and what each of them is coming back to.
Allison, then Aiden. Oh, sorry, Aiden, you look ready.
I do this really kind of bananas thing that when I tell people, they're like absolutely horrified. But I have people read my rough draft as I'm writing it, which everyone, whenever I say that, people are like, what are you thinking? I have critique partners who I love and adore and who understand my writing, what I'm trying to do. And I think the hardest part about about writing a first draft is like finishing it. And kind of when I have people who are reading it as I write it, there's sort of this accountability that goes along with it. But what's even more helpful for me is that I can get stuck on a very small decision, like should this person have brown hair or blue hair? And I will be stuck on it for 3 hours. And so if I have people who understand my story, who have seen my outline and are reading it while I go, I can jump into my group chat and be like, should this person have black hair or brown hair? Like, I don't know, I've been here for hours. And then they can like tell me, and I'm like, oh, okay, cool. One less thing that I have to like decide, and it helps me write faster and to keep going. But people are always like super horrified by that. And I just like I know that it's a crappy first draft and that I'm gonna have my friends read it, but the payoffs and like the perks to it are really like fantastic.
I think that's smart. I mean, because what's hard about writing is that we have to make so many decisions. And so if you can outsource them, hey, why not?
Exactly.
What about you, Allison? Any amazing discovery you've made?
I wish I could say that there is, but again, being my first novel, I feel like I don't really have a set process for doing it yet. So I guess maybe one thing that I would say is, don't be afraid to try things and find out what works best for you. And, whether that be outlining or pantsing it, or, I have found, as Aiden mentioned, having, other people give feedback. And I actually did have people give feedback as I was writing on this one, which is not something I normally do. And that actually ended up working out really well. But for the thing that I'm working on now, it's all going to be sort of done and have a couple editing passes on it first before I let anybody see it. So again, I'd say, don't be afraid to try different things with different novels and or different writing projects and kind of see what works for that given project.
I think that's true. And I'm a big fan of the tricking yourself into doing something that feels impossible. I'm so easy to trick. Anyway, so I would love for each of you to give one book recommendation, something that you're reading and loving, something that you don't feel has gotten enough attention. Let's start with you, Cyn.
Start with Cyn. I am of course blanking on the title because I am, but I will say it and someone will research it for me, right? There is a Peter Pan middle grade novel that came out last year by Shamile Mendez. Someone please come up with the title of it. It's darling. It's very much in 8 to 12. I think it would be a good companion book for kids who are at the age that they're reading Sisters of the Neversea.
Can't think of it. Aiden, what do you recommend?
On These Magic Shores. Sorry.
Okay.
I heard a lot of people like mermaids, so I'm going to recommend A Song Below Water by Bethany C. Morrow. It's about mermaids in Portland, and there's a lot of other magical creatures in it too. And it's wonderful, so you should absolutely buy it.
Allison and Kayla?
So my recommendation is an old book, one that came out in, I think, the late 90s. It's called Midnight's Choice, and it is a vampire novel by Kate Thompson. It's a lot, since a lot of you guys are writers. One of the things that I really like kind of championing is people who approach a familiar topic in an unusual way. And in this book, it is about a girl who meets a hot vampire guy or whatever, and then realizes that he like has a lot going on in such a way that he's kind of more of a monster than a cool love interest. And it's about how she both defeats and escapes him in a way that I have not seen vampires written before or since. And I'm a huge proponent of reading fiction to learn how to write fiction. And it's one of my favorites as a learning tool. So if you buy Darling and you like Darling and you like the idea of that, perspective of something that's familiar, but written in a way that feels very, very fresh, that's a really good book that I use to kind of help me develop that skill.
Cool. Allison?
I started looking at my shelves and then I panicked because I wanted to recommend everything on there. So I'm just going to cheat and recommend what I'm currently reading, which I'm really loving, is called We Are Satellites by Sarah Pinsker. It is a science fiction novel. Basically, there's a new technology that comes out called pilots, and it's sort of supposed to help people focus better. And everybody starts getting them, except, the story is focused on sort of one family with a daughter who suffers from seizures, so she's unable to get one. And one of her mothers is very much sort of anti, this technology. She doesn't entirely trust it, and she also wants to support her daughter. So it's like half the family has it, the other mother decides to get it, and the son really wants it, so they get it, and then the other mother and the daughter don't get it. And it's kind of like the tensions that arise from that, and then a lot of questions around access and who gets it, and how is it really affecting people. And it's multi-point of view, and I feel like every character is, very nicely distinctly written, and it's just a very, smooth read, and I'm really enjoying it. So I would recommend people check it out. It came out just earlier this month.
Sounds amazing. Now we have time for just a couple of questions. Drop them into the chat, folks, and I will select them. Outside of these 4 books and the original, what's your favorite version of Peter Pan? Does anyone have one?
Lost Boys is my favorite other version, and it really does highlight through the metaphor that you're talking about magical being of eternal youth that slips into the bedrooms of the innocent and whisks them away. It's clearly a vampire story, right? It's just much more forward in that. And also they say the name Michael probably 100,000 times. So if you're ever on YouTube, look up Lost Boys Michael, and it'll be something to do after you've refreshed with the movie.
Okay, I've always read Peter as a gender diverse character. Whoops, the question is zipped away from me. Does anyone have thoughts on Peter Pan's gender identity?
I could definitely see that, especially with the way the plays always kind of had a female actress play the Peter Pan role. So I do feel like that is kind of baked into, there's a kind of fluidity in the character, and even just sort of the, the childlike and fey aspects. It seems like, Peter's designed to be a very, very shifting character without a rigidly defined gender. So I love that interpretation.
Here's a question for Aiden. This was your first book sold. Cemetery Boys was your debut. How does this nutty publishing world work?
It's a long story, so let me think of the cliff notes. I sold Lost in the Neverwoods, and when it was time to talk about my option book and start pitching that, so your option clause is like your publisher gets first dibs basically on the next book that you write. And I pitched Cemetery Boys, and Lost in the Neverwoods is white, cishet, and honestly, it's what let me enter the realm of publishing. And because I kind of got my shoulder in, I was able to be like, now what about this really diverse, like queer, trans, Latinx story? And I thought that they were going to say no. I thought they were going to hate it. But it was, out of like the 5 pitches that I gave, it was the one that they were most excited about. And I was absolutely floored. And so after I wrote like the outline for Cemetery Boys and like submitted it, they were like, how do you feel about having Cemetery Boys be your debut novel? And honestly, like that was really important to me, because there's a lot of pressure when you're a debut author about your debut novel, and what does that say about you and your brand? I do not have a consistent brand at all. And so I was like, yes, I would love to have Cemetery Boys be my debut. And so that's what happened. We ended up switching it. I had to write Cemetery Boys in 6 weeks in order to kind of hit these like bananas deadlines that we had. So that's how that came to be. Lost in the Neverwoods let me pave the way for me to be able to write Cemetery Boys. And so I will always be deeply indebted to that story.
One last question. What advice would you give your younger writer self? Does anyone want to tackle this one?
Can I grab it? All right. I would probably tell myself to spend a significant amount of time developing some more alternative skills. Writing's always been something where I just kind of like, I do what I want, I write what I want, whatever happens is what happens. I feel like if I had spent some time paying attention to like copywriting skills, I wouldn't be getting angry emails about you put commas everywhere or you don't know how this punctuation works, or like your spelling is bad. My editors, especially because I have an English degree. So like I would tell myself to focus on learning these like core bedrock skills.
All right, we are out of time. Everyone, thank you so much for coming. Kayla, Allison, Aiden, Sin, thank you. You are all brilliant and magnificent, and I'm so glad to have gotten to spend this time with you. Thanks to everyone who came this afternoon or this evening. Everyone, put your hands together for our authors. Once again, I am Martha Brockenbrough. I do believe in fairies. I love these authors and their books, and I hope that you check them all out. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Mado.